Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to you to our event in the series One Click to Europe. Exceptionally, we're not holding this in the Hessen Representation Office in Brussels, but we are in the State Secretary in Wiesbaden. My name is Lisa-Hanifa Habib. I'm your moderator today. The topic today is 75 years Hessen Constitution, the role of regions in Europe, and this is hosted by the Hessen Minister for Federal and European Affairs, Lucia Puttrich. We're going to ask her how she views the role of regions in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, the founding of Hessen on the 1st December 1946 is part and parcel of European history. After the gruels of war, it was a sign of hope and new departure. On the 1st December 1946, the citizens of Hessen held the first election ever for the Hessen Landtag, and at the same time they voted on the Hessen Constitution. In this, they laid the foundations for the land, for the region as we know today, democratic, constitutional and cosmopolitan. This constitution is not only the oldest of the Western German regions, but it is also older than the constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany itself. And in these past 75 years, a lot has happened in Hessen, in Germany and in Europe. We have always seen ourselves in the heart of Europe and we've always felt European. The citizens of Hessen again showed this in 2018 in a referendum concerning the so-called Europe article within the Constitution. This was a clear yes for Europe. Maybe this is due to the federal structure in Germany. However, the state of Hessen has always felt a strong and self-confident part of the European legislative process. We have an impact on the federal level via the Bundesrat, and in the Committee of Regions, we voice the needs of our region directly on a European level. As a state, a region, we make good use of the means of co-shaping that we are provided with, and we can proudly say that we are one of the most active regions of Europe. Our representation office in Brussels is a multi-regions office. We are closely working together with partner regions from Italy, France and Poland. In this building, we are strong together and we concretely live a European reality. Ladies and gentlemen, as so often before in European history, challenges lie ahead of us now. With the Conference on the Future of Europe, the European institutions have started to reflect on the coming structure, design and objectives of the European Union. Most importantly, the dialogue with the citizens is one of the main priorities. I am delighted that I may represent the Bundesrat in the plenary of the Conference on the Future of Europe. Today, we want to talk about 75 years of Hessen, but also about the future of the European Union. So we're going to look back in the past, we're going to look on present times and into the future, and I wish you an interesting discussion. 75 years, the role of regions in Europe. This is a topic which we're going to deal with today. What happened to our region state in the past 75 years and what role does Hessen play within the European Union? This is what I'm going to look into with the former president of the Hessen Landtag, Karl Starzacher. This is just one of his many offices, and the current president of the Hessen Landtag, Boris Rhein. A warm welcome to you both. Mr. Starzacher, to start with you, at this moment, this year, we are celebrating 75 years of Hessen. We can say that you have actively shaped yourself this period. You have been in contact with the history of Hessen all the time. What can we be proud of as Hessen citizens? I personally had the privilege of meeting Georg August Zinn. I was at the time the representative of the pupils on a regional level, and I worked as a personal advisor together with Albert Oswald, Holger Börner, Walter Wallmann, Hans Eichel, Roland Koch, and now Volker Bouffier. I've met most of the minister presidents, the prime ministers of Hessen personally. And I believe that if you look back at the times of Georg August Zinn, a few years after the founding of Hessen, we can say that integration of displaced people and refugees was the main factor, and also the founding of the Hessentag, which were definitely things that co-shaped Hessen. Mr. Rhein, Hessentag was mentioned. From your point of view, why is the history of our Hessen state a success story? Well, amongst others, because, and here I would like to come back to the Hessentag and everything which Mr. Starzacher mentioned, I believe that we managed to bring together and integrate so many different people in this region, many different cultures, ways of living. There were the refugees, the displaced prior to them. And I think in Hessen we are good with that. We are a cosmopolitan state. This is also linked to all the other activities such as the airport, of course, of Frankfurt. And it is also linked to the fact that the traditions of the Americans that freed the country, well, we sort of copied them. We're cosmopolitan. We like people from outside. We don't repel them. We don't push them away. Mr. Starzacher, I mentioned it, in the 90s, you were president of the Landtag in Hessen, and back then we were in the center of Europe as well, but we did not have the same role in Brussels that we have now. The founding of the Committee of Regions and the European Affairs Committee, well, these were the first step towards Brussels. Which were the challenges back then? I remember discussion I was invited to back then together with the Hessen Center for Political Education. Well, I was among the hosts, and this had the title, a little bit provocative, Europe End of Federalism. And linked to the Maastricht Treaty, there were quite some skepticists in the political ranks, people who thought that the Maastricht Treaty would threaten structures, federal structures, and that the role of regions were not visible anymore in Europe. I even remember a discussion that we had in 1993. Back then, the opposition from CDU had asked that the two representatives from Hessen were sent to the Committee of Regions and that they should be a member of the government and one of the Landtag. But I myself did not go. I refused because, linked to the Constitution and the federal structure, in my role within the Committee of Regions, I would have been bound by instructions, which would mean that the Hessen government would have told me how to behave in the occasion of negotiations. So I said, well, then it is of no use that I go there as a member of the parliament. But in 1993, this was quite a controversial discussion. And for you personally, so on the one hand, you had Landtagspräsident, you had this office, and if you know that things are changing, the country, the state, the region state is opening up towards Brussels, what did you think about that back then? Well, my first experience in Europe was that in 1961 I had a privilege to go to France to school for a term. I was the first German pupil after the Second World War in the school, and this gave me the opportunity to make quite some experiences. Amongst others, I learned that our viewpoint is not the same everywhere in the world, not even in Europe, and that we have different cultural and political foundations. So Europe mainly meant peace to me. And the first contacts that we had to other regions in Europe, for me, they always were under the viewpoint of being friends. We have friends in Europe, we communicate, we look at common interests and try to enforce them together. But I must say that the unification process in Europe for me always was a positive thing, despite all the difficulties, because peace was always my main concern. We are soon talking about the role of regions. Back to you. You are the current president of the Landtag, of the state parliament. Can you tell me how the works of the Committee of Regions developed over time? 75 years, that's quite some time, or since the founding, that's quite some time. Well, that's a good question, but first I would like to come back to something Mr. Starzacher said. You have to imagine, I mean, for my generation, it's almost something that we cannot imagine. We've never lived, experienced anything else but liberty, freedom, prosperity. My mother was born in 1935, so she knows what it means to live in a dictatorship. She knows what it means when a dictator steals your childhood. We Germans led the world onto the abyss of destruction, even ethically speaking. I mean, this is incredible. You can hardly imagine it. And despite this, the European Union included us who actually destroyed everything. And this is why I don't like to talk about an economic miracle. For me, it's a democratic miracle for Germany, which made Europe possible for us. The development of our country could not have been imagined had we not been led back into the family of nations, if we had to stay out like outcasts. So we have to give credit to Europe for this, because all the following regions are benefiting from Europe. And this is why Europe, for me, first of all, is a question of freedom, of liberty, of democracy. And this is why we should actually not only celebrate Europe on the occasion of elections, but we should celebrate and make publicity for what Europe makes possible, well beyond the curving degree of bananas and everything else. But you asked about the role of regions, and here I come back to Mr. Starzacher as well. There was quite some debate, even though you were talking about polarization. This was quite a high level, so sometimes even now I would wish for some debates on that high level. But something else back then, which is still on the table now. Within the Committee of Regions, Hessen is still, and we can see it in whatever way we want, not through the parliament, is not represented through the parliament, which should be the case, but by Mr. Weinmeister, who is the state secretary for Hessen. You would actually say, well, that's wrong. The first power should sit in the Committee of Regions. And the executor of the decisions taken by the first powers would come then. But there's a risk that a freely elected president of a Landtag would be bound by the government, and this is why the Constitution made it otherwise. I'm a deputy to Mr. Weinmeister. And then in the end, of course, you also have a question of who is going there. And I think with Mr. Weinmeister, we have an amazing representative with a huge willpower to represent us. He also has a past as a member of the Landtag, of the parliament. So in the end, I think this is not a state question or a static question, do we send the government or the parliament? But what is most important is that we have people sitting there who are dedicated. The Committee of Regions is a really great institution. I think it was a really intelligent decision to found it, because it allows for greater involvement of those who actually wouldn't have it otherwise, in very intelligent manners. For example, also via the possibility to refer to the European Court of Justice through the Committee of Regions. And I think such mechanisms have developed in a wonderful manner. What was there in the beginning? Just another institution, just another circle, actually then revealed itself as an institution that makes Europe more tangible for the regions. We will soon look into the future and will come back to this point. But Mr. Starzacher, I would like to come back to the representation office in Brussels. Our generation knows, well, we have a representation in Brussels, we represent our interests within the European Union. But back then, when the representation office was built, was created, how was that back then? Well, Hessen always had representation offices in Bonn, in the federal government as well. And that, of course, made cooperation with Bundesrat easier. And when 1989 Hessen inaugurated its representation office in Brussels, I was the chief whip of the parliamentary group for SPD in the Landtag, and I was quite critical to this because I was thinking, why do we also have to open an office in Brussels? That costs a lot of money. And in the meantime, I've completely changed my opinion. I think it is very important that the representation office in Brussels is working closely together with partner regions and seen with other regions in a building. And here I would like to come back to what Boris Rhein said. It's always also about the people who are sitting there, who is the head of the office. And I think that we really have a strong, strong position there. Mr. Rhein, what about the region in Brussels? What does it mean that we're presented there? Well, it's not just making us visible, it has a huge importance. We couldn't even work without such a representation office, that's clear, because in all these years, we have an institutional fabric that has grown over time with the Committee of Regions, thanks to the Lisbon treaties. Also, the acceptance of subsidiarity, another discussion that's really important, because that was not just clear from the start. The discussions were led in a way that, like Mr. Starzacher said, people were afraid that our traditions, our traditional federalism would be weakened by these new institutions. And then, of course, the representation office, that's really important. So this is all this institutional fabric, also with the ministries for European affairs. I don't remember when the first European affairs ministries were founded. Was Sir Rupert von Plotnitz the first? Well, Herbert Günther was the Minister for Interior Affairs. He was also in charge of European affairs, but he was not a minister for European affairs. Right, that's right. And that was also important because at some point we said there's a minister who is in charge of European affairs. And then there were also the European affairs committees, which were also not there from the beginning. So actually this institutional fabric around Europe grew over time. And as you said, Mrs. Habib, the partnerships, which is also very important, that's not folkloric. It's not just so that people can visit each other in Europe, but it's rather about working closely together and defending European interests together. What you defend together beyond regional and national borders is always stronger, heavier weighted than if you go alone. For example, the presidents of the Landtag, we don't only meet with the number of 16 plus the Bundestag's president, but the Austrian presidents and colleagues are also sitting with us. South Tyrol is sitting with us. So that makes us 27 presidents, coming from quite self-confident parliaments, because we all have legislative powers. We're not just representative. We do have legislative power in Germany. We decide important things, and the most important things are actually happening in the Landtag. The Bund is composed by the Länders, by the single states, and draws its authority from them. Very often this is quite underestimated. And of course, if you have other partner regions, then on a European level, you can even have more weight. So it actually grew into a really big network with lots of opportunities. Mr. Starzacher, in Brussels, when you look at Europe in detail, then the regional level meets the European level. Hessen meets Europe in Brussels directly. In these past dozens of years, did we manage to link interests in a good way, in a good manner? Well, I haven't been active as a politician for a long time, and I've not always closely looked at the role of regions in Brussels. But I do believe that we are perceivable. Of course, this doesn't mean that the federal government is released from its responsibility for the federal structure and the subsidiarity principle, which is also enshrined in the Constitution. But the regions have to be included into policy on this level as well. So I think a good communication between all levels is really an important basis. And this means that it's important that there is a Minister for European Affairs and that there is a representation office so that they can care for these links within communication. And I think that we have a great system. Or let it say the other way around, I'm not worried at all about the regions being visible on a European level. But, and I think that's not only my impression, general public is currently more focused on the role of Poland or Hungary or how Europe deals the corona pandemic, rather than whether everything is well on the different levels for the regions. We will come back to this later. Mr. Rhein, I have a question for you because you also mentioned the partner regions. We're not living on our own in Brussels. We are sitting in the same building with our partner regions. What is the signal that these partnerships can send out towards the European Union when you live together and when you act together? Well, I think that's a really strong signal. They are united, these regions are united, they represent their interests together. But it is also important that we look at the message towards the national states. You mentioned Poland. Thanks to this common exchange and mutual exchange and cooperation, possibly. Of course, it doesn't mean that we will change the entire situation in Poland, but the national government in Poland does perceive that what they do is seen and that people are critical about it, and they realize that we are working between regions and that we indicate to them that they have to be careful that the European process is not endangered. So it's actually a mutual impact going both ways towards Europe and also towards the national states. Mr. Starzacher, what can Europe learn from us, from Hessen? Integration, of course. We talked about Poland and Hungary, where integration is viewed in a different manner than in our region and country. Open communication as well, which has always been one of our strong points within disputes in the parliament. Within society, I think that we are a really good example for an open Europe. Mr. Rhein, when there are representatives from the partner regions, do you talk about such topics? Do you also look critically, for example, do the Polish representatives look towards Hessen and look at the values such as rule of law, democracy, where they say, oh yeah, we look up to you for that? Yes, definitely. Personally, I do see that there is an open discussion with us. Of course, sometimes they also ask for understanding for national situations. We cannot measure with German standards and apply German standards everywhere. I think we have to be really careful there. The world is different, diverse. There are so many different identities. So that's also something that we have to acknowledge. However, I clearly see that there's critical discussion on what is happening in the home countries, and I think that's important because they also transport it back into their country. This is why such exchange and such discussions are very open, very, well, full of confidence, full of loyalty and full of friendship, and whenever necessary, also clear and critical. Mr. Rhein, another question. The regions are the heart of Europe. What can the regions do so that Europe will be better? I think that regions do a lot already. I would rather make more claims towards the European institutions so that they see the regions more and take them more seriously. Of course, you also have to look through a German-looking glass. I don't think any other part in the world, this might be a bit exaggerated, but I think it's almost like that. There are so strong federal elements. We have sovereign regions, we have sovereign region states with sovereign legislation, with huge competencies and huge powers. On a European level, this is not something that's common. It's rather very particular, and I see that European institutions sometimes have difficulty dealing with that because they don't know it, because they don't know in how far our possibilities go. So I think this is something that needs to be made more visible. Just an example, we have received judgment from the European Court of Justice saying that the General Data Protection Regulation is of mandatory application for the Landtag, and this interferes heavily with our regulatory powers. Even our data protection officers and the ones of the federal level say that's just not possible. It interferes so much with our national identity that it just can't be. Of course, we have to accept the rule, the judgment of the European Court of Justice, but together with Parliament and the Commission, we have to make sure that we are taken out of the regulatory area, out of this regulation. We shouldn't even have been included in that. The European Parliament itself is exempted, which means that the European Parliament is higher than the Hessen Landtag, which cannot be because we ourselves have even more legislative powers than the European Parliament. This needs to be made more aware, made more aware. We need awareness, and this is where we have to create such awareness in the bodies on European level. This in turn shows how important communication is, not just in committees and bodies on the European level, even the members of the Parliament and representatives from Hessen have to focus on that. And both the members of the European Parliament and the members of the Bundestag will need to be included in this communication, because through the Council, of course, there's also a manner of possibility of critically checking these regulations. Do you think that the Conference on the Future of Europe is a possibility to give more visibility to the regions so that they can say, these are our proposals so that we are better seen in Brussels? Personally, I have to admit that only in the preparation of this meeting, of this event today, I learned about the Conference on the Future of Europe. Now, I personally read the news all the time. I'm quite actively, I have a lot of information on political processes in Europe, but this shows clearly that communication around this conference is not enough. This is also quite in its early stages. So the idea as such, I think it's great that citizens from Europe, and especially young people, are invited to put in their own ideas. Now, what's interesting is, how serious are they going to be taken? Is it just about inviting them? Please tell us what you would like to have. And the young people then 2 or 3 years later have the impression that nobody took them seriously. It was just acknowledged and that's all. Well, that's not what we want to create. So such open discussions and processes need to actually lead to something concrete. And if that happens, I think, then that's a great example that beyond borders, the consent, the approval for Europe and trust into Europe will be strengthened. Mr. Rhein, you are probably very up to date what this topic is concerned. So what about your opinion about the Conference on the Future of Europe? How do you see that? Do you think proposals come to Brussels directly from the regions? Well, to be honest, the conference that we're talking about, well, I didn't learn about it just in preparation for today, but I only learned about it in a discussion with the presidents of the Landtag of the different regions of Austria and Germany. They were talking with the commissioner in charge. And to be honest with you, that's where I learned about the conference. So there's a lack of knowledge. This conference on the future of Europe is not known well enough. I think the idea as such is really great. But I was under the impression, and not just me, all the other colleagues as well, that it's still quite a nebulous thing. The commissioner did not really know what they wanted, and the questions that Mr. Starzacher asked, what the aim actually is and how it will be led into a concrete proposal, well, that's not defined yet. I'm really happy that Mrs. Puttrich is our voice in this process, because she will do exactly that. She will indicate exactly what is happening on a regional level and what we request and require. And I think this will make it more tangible and less foggy. I would like to mention another aspect, the role of media. Of course, I don't want to be critical on the role of media in the last federal election campaign. If you look at the pictures that circulated for weeks and were the heads on the top pages rather than talking about content, I personally think that the media have to talk positively about Europe. Any media, actually. But when that doesn't happen, then the messages will just not get through to the citizens. Mr. Rhein, what can regions do so that communication will be better? And that media actually talk about Europe. We, on our side, of course, use the institutional possibilities and rights that we have to do that. But I think it's also right to say that we need lots of events, lots of meetings in place, as it happens, that we come to Brussels. It's not just something that we have to do at the side. No, it's really something very important. We need common events. We need members of the European Parliament here. We need contacts. We need to network with the regions, with partner regions. We've created another process because the partners are there, which is on a high level, government level. As a minister, I closely work together with Aquitaine. Of course, this was also linked to the fact that the Minister of Science was also in charge of the College Geisenheim University. With wine as well, we have a really strong partner with Bordeaux in Europe for this topic. But now we really have to bring the parliaments closer together, and this is where we are focusing on a process within the Landtag, where we are devising a strategy, a holistic global strategy, how to create partnerships between the single parliaments. I don't know how to call it. Basically, it's about the fact that a group from a parliament composed of different parties actually deals with a particular part of a region and is in charge of that. I don't remember the word now, but it will come to me after the meeting. We want to do this and push this also in Brussels in a way that the European members of the European Parliament are actually more closely engaged, and that we don't just leave it up to the government, but that we are more agile in our approach and in our support to the government. And I think this is the right way to foster the interests of the regions and nuance them more. Mr. Starzacher, there is a need of the region to have more impact in Brussels, I guess. But how can you do that? Well, definitely via the Committee of Regions. There must be a consensus that is also then transported from the Parliament and the Council, not overlooked by Council and Parliament and the Commission. But as far as the role of the German federal states is concerned, I also think that it's important that towards the federal government that there are certain expectations and that we formulate them in a clear way, because a chancellor has different possibilities to act on a European level and focus on the interests of a region on a European level. And Germany, we can definitely say that, plays an important role on a European level. So when we have, well, I wouldn't call it desires, but claims, needs. And there you have to be really sensitive in the judgment that need also to correspond to certain situations in other member countries. We cannot just create special provisions only for Germany, but this is where the cooperation with partner regions in Europe is so important, not only in Europe, but also outside of Europe. When we have such good cooperation, then I think that the role of the regions can be really strengthened. Of course, this is a laborious process. And if you look at the current problems where we're talking about the rule of law, Poland, Hungary is also mentioned, because Hungary, of course, is supporting Poland in this debate. Of course, the solution of such problems is a priority at the moment on a European level, so we also have to put it into the right perspective. Mr. Rhein, so, for example, let's say that Poland is punished and your partner region Wielkopolska does not receive European money. It is being punished. How can a region react to something like that, and do you exchange on such topics? Well, of course, I have to say, as a land, as a state, as a region state, we are, well, I wouldn't call it helpless, but we're lacking in influence. This is such a clear process. I mean, you can imagine the power of the European Union. They can just say there's a punishment of 1 million euros per month for a country where 1 million euros is an enormous sum of money. Of course, that has an impact on the regions, a negative impact. So you have to be really sensitive when you talk about this, and really sensitive with the instruments. We can hardly do anything about it. I personally am therefore quite skeptical whether this is the right way to go. I'm critical whether we should take such hard action, as I would call it, because of course it leads to problems in a region. The Polish government, well, okay, it's not just nothing for them, but in a region it's really a big problem when you have money, lack of money. My colleague said it's all about the principle of unanimity. As a Minister of the Interior in our meeting of the Ministers of the Interior, I really appreciated this principle because it meant that we had to find a solution, and it meant that majorities were not the ones who could take all the gain, because, of course, majorities also change over time. And on a European level, well, if we were not forced to come to unanimity, to a complete consensus in so many areas, then I think we would lose Eurosceptic countries, because they would always lose and they would become ever more Eurosceptic. So I think it doesn't work to work on such a level with sanctions, nor with using force, nor with levering majorities. But of course, if you want to, well, if you have expectations and needs, because every country also benefits from the European Union, you do have to enforce certain things. But I think we have to be really sensitive and careful, because otherwise you would feel in the regions in particular that that's where you get the problems. Mr. Starzacher, when in Brussels you have certain decision-taking in favor of certain regions, and you would change it, actually, would the European Union be able to deal with that? You would have to tell me what exactly you're talking about, because I'm under the impression that the German region states, in their regulatory competence, I'm talking about subsidiarity here, are not limited in a way that would create concern. The Länder have really great big competences, as my colleague said, as quite a vast legislative power, which means that the current situation, also for the single region states in Germany, is quite positive. I cannot say in how far the Committee of Regions could be improved in its way of working, but I would say it's all about communication. As far as Europe is concerned, I'm expecting that Europe is not excluded from the discussions around the forming of the new government. The reporting around it doesn't show so, but for me, the topic of peace is really important. So even when we're talking about creating a new government, forming a new government, I would hope that there is big importance given to Europe. My last question for you. What do you wish for Hessen and for its role in Brussels for the coming years? What ideas do you have about it? I wish that on the highest European level, we will manage to settle disputes and come to a common understanding as far as the rule of law is concerned. And when we manage that, then Hessen will continue to feel well in Europe. Mr. Rhein also said it in the beginning, the role of Hessen also after 1945, what was made possible for us. We are in a strong position, somewhat envied by many, and I think this is what is going to be there for the future as well. And Mr. Rhein, where do you see us in Europe in the next years? I want to reply to this question in such a way. I think we would all be better off if we could reflect on the weighting of the institutions in Europe. For example, the European Parliament, which is democratically legitimized, does not have the possibilities that it should have, and the European Commission on the other side, which has an incredible amount of power and possibilities. There's a huge imbalance that we need to solve, which means that the European Parliament needs to have more possibilities, more impact. I think on European level, we need more of such a system like in Germany, more of a federal system, also in the European institutions. And I believe that we should reflect and discuss about this. There's pro and there's contra. For example, the European Commission president, should we elect him personally, directly? Should it stay as it is? Should it be like in the Bundesrat, that there's a rotation principle and everybody takes presidency at some point? I think these questions are really important to be discussed for the acceptancy and the co-shaping in Europe. 75 years of Hesse and the role of regions in Europe. I think we could discuss this topic for hours. Unfortunately, our time is up. I would like to warmly thank you for this interesting discussion. And I wish you a wonderful afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you for your attention. I would also like to invite you to our next online event, which will be on 16 November. Bulgaria has voted. We would be really happy if you were coming as well. We wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.